The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the mountains of mist. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning. All right, we are recording, so we can just kind of talk about it.
Okay.
Um, Starting from the beginning, I know the kind of the whole idea of this show was you appreciate the series because you understand its effect on the genre and the mechanics in it and whatnot, but you aren't necessarily the biggest fan of it. And I'm kind of on the other side where I'm a really big fan and I also understand its effect on the genre and its mechanics and all these things. So, getting right into it, like I wanted to kind of pick your brain and sort of have kind of a back and forth about starting with the opening section, like their time there in Two Rivers. That includes like the day before, winter night, and then like the build up to them leaving. What When you think about that section, what comes to mind that makes you kind of hesitant to enjoy it? It is a bit derivative. I can admit that. I think the first three books in this franchise are derivative, kind of on purpose. But besides that, like, is there something more that you were kind of thinking of when it comes to what makes you hesitate or not like it as much?
Sure. So I think I want to clarify a little. I know we've talked in the past, and I mentioned this briefly. Is I
Yeah.
think the first two books are phenomenal, and there's a reason the series defines the genre, and it's because the first two books are so good, and the third book is still really good. I'd say the fourth book is still good, but then there's a steady decline in quality, in my opinion, and we can talk about why later. But I have very few negative things to say about the first book. And I think a lot of the criticisms of it from people are not justified or aren't. Some of them are, but some of them are not. Like, I think the first thing that comes to mind, and I don't want to dwell on this particularly, but you know, if you're going to talk about the Two Rivers section, the first thing I think people are going to complain about is the similarities to Lord of the Rings. It's a direct derivation ripoff of Fellowship of the Ring, the opening specifically. Um, and I don't think that's a problem because Fellowship of the Ring is such a classic story. It's the classic fantasy story. And I can see why people in the modern day reading it would have a problem because it's been done so many times it's derivative, but this was written in the early 90s. It was not derivative at the time. So you have to understand, yes, it's deliberately aping Lord of the Rings, but at the time that was still something that wasn't overdone to death. If I'm going to be critical, I'm going to say the very specific, like deliberately copying every single thing that happens in the opening of Fellowship in the first couple chapters is a little on the nose. It's not bad. It's not poorly done. It makes sense the way it is. It all fits into the world, but it's just he hits so many of the same notes of Fellowship. Mysterious black riders, a wizard shows up. Oh no, we all have to leave. It hits so many of those things. I can see why people read it and go ugh, especially today when many other people have done that. I think those people are wrong, but I absolutely understand why they do that. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. What you're talking about, the annoyance that some audience members will have at it for being uh, very derivative of Lord of the Rings. Something interesting from my perspective is I'm actually coming at it as someone who read The Wheel of Time first. I will be able to tell, I'm sure, and now that you're talking about it, I can see it. The similarities between the opening to Fellowship of the Ring and the opening to The Eye of the World. It's even down to like there's a party going on. The,
Yep.
the wizard shows up to the party.
Yep.
Uh, there are some intriguing differences, though I would argue, and I think you would agree that when we look at things such as the attack on the two rivers during winter night, rather Emmons Field in particular, because
Uh-huh.
the whole two rivers isn't affected, but Emmons Field is attacked. That doesn't necessarily happen in Lord of the Rings, and
No.
I I can see broad stroke wise there being a problem, but that'd be kind of like I would argue anyway. It would kind of be comparing, or rather calling, someone like, and I don't know if you recognize these musical artists or not, but someone in my audience might, calling the Fat Rat derivative of Daft Punk. You
I
could
do catch that
argue,
reference, yeah.
yeah, you could argue that because technically the Fat Rat didn't really get popular until after Daft Punk kind of had their heyday, but
Hmm.
arguably they're just writing in the same genre, and genres have tropes and genres have generalities about them. And
Yeah.
so yes, there's a party, yes, there's a wizard, yes, there's black riders. That's true. But in Lord of the Rings, do those black riders attack the party and blow it up and force the wizard to defend the city? No. And so there's some nuance to how Jordan goes about writing his own adventure. And I think, uh, and I'll play a clip of it now if I can find it. There's a interview he does that is usually tagged on several of the audiobooks. I don't know if you've listened to it or not, but there's an interview he does where he talks about his inspiration behind the Wheel of Time series. And essentially it was he didn't like how country folk were portrayed in traditional fantasy because he has been around country folk. He grew up around country folk. So he knows how they'd respond to this sort of thing. And so to get a more realistic story out of his country folk, he had to do things radically different. He didn't believe that the country folk would see a random wizard roll up into town and be like, "Oh, okay, we'll trust you entirely and just drop everything we're doing and go and
Mm.
live on this adventure." No, he thought that they'd have to be forced out, that they'd have to essentially be pushed out of their comfort zone because if they weren't, they wouldn't leave. They wouldn't want to leave.
Hi, this is Laura Wilson of Audio Renaissance, and I'm speaking with Robert Jordan. How did you decide to start writing the Wheel of Time series?
I began writing The Wheel of Time because a great many notions had been bouncing around inside my head and they started to coalesce. I wondered what it was really like to be tapped on the shoulder and told, "You were born to be the savior of mankind." I didn't think it would be very much the way it is in so many books where someone pops up and says, "Hi, I was born to be the savior of mankind, and here's the prophecy," and everybody says, "Oh, well, let's go then." I thought self-interest would play a big part. And I was also wondering about the source of legends and myths. They can't all be anthropomorphizations of natural events. Some of them have to be distortions of things that actually happened, distortions by being passed down over generations. And that led into the distortion of information over distance, whether that's temporal distance or spatial distance. The further you are in time or space from the actual event, the less likely you are to know what really happened. And then finally, there was the thought about something that happens in Tolkien and a lot of other places. The wise old wizard shows up in a country village and says, "You must follow me to save the world." And the villagers say, "Right then, Gov, off we go." Well, I did a lot of growing up in the country, and I've always thought that what those country folk would say, "Oh, is that so? Look here, have another beer. Have two on me. I'll be right back. I will, really." And then slip out the back door. There were a lot of things that came together, and even once I started, of course, a lot of things built in and added in and changed.
And that's what he does in the opening is Rand, less so Matt, but Rand and Perrin especially don't want to leave. They're content there in the rivers. They're fine with their tiny little lives, and that's they don't want anything else. But then the Trollocs attack, and the inciting incident forces them out into the world. Um, and that is a tiny bit, I think, more. I hesitate to use the word realistic, but I would argue it's more unique and different than having your main character wait in his hobbit hole for 40 years for the wizard to come back and invite him on an adventure.
Yes, yeah. I
And
completely agree. The way he does rural folk is very faithful to how rural people behave in my experience as a rural person myself.
right, yeah. And I'm not entirely rural. I grew up in like a poorer side of town though, and we spent a lot of time at farmers market. So I have some experience, and a lot of the people that I went to church with growing up were farmer folk, and so I have some of that, um, experience growing up. Cool. So what didn't you like, or what stood out to you? I guess, sort of as it sort of transitioned from, like, the attack has happened, everyone's trying to rebuild, they're stubborn to river folks, to now, okay, we're leaving. What stood out to you there? Anything of note?
Well, I have a spicy take on this, and it's only vaguely related to your question, so I
Okay, that's
apologize.
fine.
But I think I'm thinking of a very famous nerd culture individual who we've both interacted with on X a few times, so I'm not going to name, who did a review of these books recently whenever we were recording this and said that they couldn't handle it. They read the first 100 pages and it was too boring and they stopped. And I think that's uh, indicative. A lot of people say that. And that's why I think this person said that. And that just proves to me that none of those people actually read the book,
Mm,
because that transition from we're sitting around in Edmonds Field enjoying ourselves to we're leaving and going on this adventure and something interesting happens is pretty fast. It happens pretty quickly. It's only in the first, what, 3 chapters,
yeah.
if I remember correctly? Yeah,
I believe it's
and
the
those
first five
chapters
chapters, but yeah, 100 pages
5.
easily.
Yeah, less than 100 pages. It's
Yeah,
really it does not happen as slowly as people make it out. It happens way faster than in Fellowship of the Ring, which nobody will say anything
true.
negative about because it's Tolkien. Um, so I think there's an epidemic of people who start reading this and they see that it is so much like Tolkien and that it's so much like the Tolkien derivative works out there, which do the same thing, take forever to explain the main character's backstory. I'm thinking of Malice by John Gwynne. It takes a long time to get to the point where anything starts happening in the story. And there's a lot of people who do that. There's a lot of people who like those books. I'm not trying to criticize that. They start reading this and they think it's going to be the same way, and so they just go, ugh, I don't care, and they give up. Like, 10 pages before the village gets attacked and everybody leaves, and now you're on a much more interesting adventure. So I think that is something that I see people do wrong all the time. And I I can't call that a fault of Jordan's because the book is too popular. It
Right.
clearly does not stop the majority of people from reading it. It may damage the longevity of the book. Like, it may start to make it less popular moving forward from, this point in 2026 where we're talking about it, because more and more people seem to be having that experience of, this just reminds me of every other Tolkien derivative fantasy, and I'm done. And it's really, in terms of pacing at least, not, and certainly not once you get past book one. So
Oh, very true. I mean, granted, the series is, what is it, 14 books long,
yeah.
and Tolkien had six, because technically each book is broken down into two books. So I think people are comparing. I hesitate to use the idiom of apples and oranges because they aren't, but I would say, like, they're kind of comparing green apples versus red apples, or red apples versus honey crisps. Like, they're very different flavors, and that's on purpose. Like, these apples, or in this
Mhm.
case the fantasy book, was written for a different kind of audience necessarily than Tolkien. Tolkien wrote for an audience that grew up listening to fairy tales, whereas Jordan
Uh-huh.
wrote for an audience that grew up listening to Tolkien and Lewis.
Hmm.
And so, also on top of these things, to add, Lewis and Tolkien were British PhD, academic authors, versus Jordan, who was an everyman, so to speak, thoroughly speaking, and wrote from that everyman's perspective in an American context. That was something else that people don't take into account. People think, oh well, fantasy is fantasy is fantasy. Not really. If
No.
you compare, I think the stories American Gods by Neil Gaiman versus like anything from Tolkien, like yes, they're
Yeah.
both fantasy, but they're not. Like they're not the same thing at all. And to a lesser degree, here in the Wheel of Time versus the Lord of the Rings, we have that example again. We have the American writing style and distinctives compared to the British academic style. And in this section of the book, we see that because when they begin their run, right, they're leaving they're leaving Emmons Field to go. Eventually, they're hoping to get to Tarvalin, but they have to get there first, and it's an immediate chase sequence. There's action, there's drama
Hmm.
going on right away, even as they're running towards the Taran Ferry to get across the river. The difference there is if we then look at Lord of the Rings, and this whole show won't just be comparing this to Lord of the Rings, I promise, but the, comparing it to Lord of the Rings, they do leave Hobbiton, but they he takes, like, I think it's 4 chapters for them to finally actually leave the Hobbit like country.
Yeah, and they're
And
really long chapters.
they're long chapters. They kind of drag their feet, sometimes
Ah.
literally. And then we have that whole filler bit with granted he's one of my favorite characters, but it's still kind of filler. We have that section with Tom Bombadil.
Hmm.
You know,
You're gonna get some hate for saying that.
uh,
I'm
to be
just
fair, it is
stand
fair.
back.
I will admit Tom Bombadil is one of my favorite characters of all time, but I can also admit at the same time that that chapter was filler. He could have been
Yep.
used differently in that same story and better. But getting back to the Wheel of Time, um, so now they're on the escape. They're leaving Emmons Field for the sake of the people of Emmons Field. They don't want them to get hurt on their account. Rand has said goodbye to his father. It's very dramatic. Rand now has his father's sword. That's kind of cool. We see in other fantasies more recently written, this idea of a sword bearing a mark that makes the blade, or that makes the wielder out to be a blade master. And that's something that I haven't seen really anywhere besides the Wheel of Time and a very Wheel of Time derivative work, which is oh man, um I read it a couple years ago. Shad M. Brooks. I can't remember the name of it.
Oh, Shadow of the Conqueror.
Shadow of the Conqueror. Thank you. I've
Mm-hmm.
only seen this idea in these 2 works, but I do like it, and I think it could be used in other fantasy works very well. As for that, but this Heron Mark blade, that several times during the escape from Emmons Field throughout the rest of the book, Rand has people looking at him, and they get a very different reaction to him because they see the heron mark, and they get,
Uh-huh.
some of them get confused, some of them get offended, some of them want to challenge him. Lan wants to train him and make a blade master out of him, and so there's these different reactions to it, and I think that's a really cool um, sort of world building piece where, and I think Jordan does this really well, where he has a lot of world building implied that then helps the world feel natural because they don't have to stop the flow of the book to explain, oh hey guys, by the way, this thing means this, that, and the other for 4
Uh-huh.
pages. They can just sort of include it in the story and it makes sense.
Yeah, and it's an
um
excellent
yeah, go ahead.
literary device that he uses a lot throughout the story, of this idea that the characters have a thing that other people know what it means, but they have no clue, and you have to figure it out as the audience from context clues, like um, Matt's staff that he gets
Hmm.
later, his whatever you call that thing. what's the name of his weapon? Anyway, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's something he uses a lot, and again, it's a great tool, and it's something all more authors should use because it's really easy to do.
Agreed.
Not
Uh,
as easy as an info dump, but nobody likes info dumps.
it's
So,
true. So, I mean, even authors sometimes get bored by them. But
hmm
the so what did you think? And this is kind of getting into our coming exploration of their time in Barrelon, but still kind of on the road to Barrelon here. What did you think of how Jordan handled the sort of mystique and world building around the White Cloaks and the introduction of the White Cloaks? Because they get talked about before their introduction in Barrelon, but them getting talked about helps their introduction in Barrelon make much more sense and feel much more natural. What do you think?
yeah, I agree. I agree. You needed to. You always have to set up the idea before you show it to somebody. Well, let me. You don't have to, but you should because
Mm-hmm.
then you avoid the info dump, and their appearance in the story feels like a natural part of the story. And when you don't do that, you're forced to kind of have a moment in which the characters explain why this thing is significant and who these people are, and that takes people out of the story. It feels disconnected. So I think that's great. I do think the White Cloaks are one of my complaints about this story, not because there's anything wrong necessarily with the way they are portrayed in this book, but because this book mentions them enough times that you expect them to be a major part of the story moving forward, and they're really not. A couple
Hmm.
places they come up, they have their own individual um, inputs into the plot. They're an obstacle in many places, but they aren't pivotal to the entire narrative. So it really feels like Jordan wanted to use them more, but then as he wrote the books, he was like, these don't really fit, which is fine. We all do that as authors. It's just a little disappointing in retrospect to be like, oh, it's those guys who are really not going to be around as much as I would have liked.
That's fair. There's another sort of faction that shows up much later in the book and is actually founded much later in the book, in the books, not this book in particular, but in the books generally, that I'm I'm going to have probably very much to say when we get to them. But uh these characters, and like I said with the White Cloaks, there are several factions that I wish Jordan had used more, because to
Hmm
me as the reader I'm like, that's my favorite, like that's so cool, why aren't we doing more with this?
Uh huh.
But I have to then kind of take a step back and think to myself, well, if he had focused on that, what else would have suffered? Because, and again, this is coming from a perspective of someone who'd call themselves a fan. You know,
Uh
I haven't read the series 5 times, so I can't call myself a super fan yet. But
huh.
um, I genuinely can't think of a single plot thread in the whole series that I disliked enough that I would want it replaced with one of these other with one of these other threads. Um, there's some argument to be made for some of the stuff with Perrin and Fail later on during
Yes,
the
and I
slump.
will. Don't you worry.
I'm sure we'll get there, but there's some arguments there. But even that, as a hopeless romantic and a fantasy writer who writes fantasy romances as subplots, I don't dislike it enough to want it removed, to be replaced by this other thing. And that's one of the things that I think he does so masterfully throughout the whole series. And we'll get into a little bit more of this when we get into Barrelon here. There's so much going on that he can't possibly, you know, talk about all of it, even though it's clear he has an idea of all of it, right?
Yeah.
I think he does a masterful job of this iceberg idea of world building, where we see what he wants us to see, but we know, or we feel as readers, there's so much more beneath the surface.
I completely
Yeah.
agree about the iceberg thing. Completely agree. But I think the counterpoint to what you've just said, that whole there wasn't a plot point I would subtract from, is that and this is, I think we can say it once here and then mention it briefly in the future because I will bring it up. Is
Mm,
the problem is not that you remove a plot point, is that if he had written all those other plot points more efficiently, there would have been more time to explore
mm,
more of these icebergs because there is a lot of talking that did not need to happen, and a lot of reinforcing events that, like, okay, we get it. Perrin misses his wife and wants to
Yeah.
go get her.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's not a problem in this book, though. That's not a problem
No,
in this book.
that's fair.
That's a problem in later books.
True, but this book, getting into this iceberg idea, introduces one of the coolest icebergs, and actually, it's kind of two icebergs from a certain point of view. I'm actually going to put a pin in the one I was just about to mention and go to something else. I'm curious, where do you think, and this is sort of like, not, it's not really a gotcha, but it's kind of a gotcha. So where do you think, or where would you agree with saying that Rand first uses the one power in this book?
Oh, Bella.
Okay, okay,
Strengthening
we're
Bella. Yeah.
clear.
That's
Yes,
the start of the
because
first one, yeah.
this is on the run from Emmons Field to Barrelon,
Yep.
so it's kind of in the context
The
here.
Drakkar is circling.
There's
Bella's
ball
getting
circling,
tired.
and
Hmm.
he's mentally just saying, "Go, run, run, Bella, run." And specifically, what got me is he mentions the chills. And I'm
Yep.
like, oh, okay. So that was him touching the source. Got it.
Mhm.
Cool. And then it was confirmed when Moraine was like, oh, Bella's like the strongest horse here. How weird is that? I wonder what happened.
Yep.
But
Yep. And that's like why Bella is in every single book up until the last one
mhm,
because of that. Yeah.
yeah. So Bella, it's great character number one. But something interesting that I noticed just as I was listening to the audiobook like all day today, trying to catch up to Whitebridge. But um something that I noticed was actually when Moraine was talking with Nynaeve in, I believe it's chapter 21, and we'll get there in a few minutes here, but it has to do with Rand touching the source. Um, when Moraine is talking to Nynaeve, she mentions that when a wild Aes Sedai, or like a wild weaver, if you will, first touches the
Yeah.
source, then a week later they suffer an extreme sort of backlash. So like they get sick, or they feel heat, or they can't talk, or
Yep.
any one of these kinds of side effects. And so that brings me back then to after Rand touches Bella with the source. What, because arguably, I mean, as readers, that's what we have to assume, that's the first time he uses the source at all.
Uh-huh.
Um, what then happens for the rest of the run uh towards Camelin and eventually towards Tar Valon, there's several points where Rand just sort of starts to feel sick, and he sort of just like is tired, and it doesn't really make sense. Because I noticed this, because this is now we're in Barrelon, sort of in the conversation here. We've gotten to Barrelon. There's a point in Barrelon where Rand, I believe it's either just after they leave Barrelon or just before they leave Barrelon. But if I'm recalling it properly, there's a point where Rand just feels half dead, and
Yep.
I think what it is he normally would want to go down to the common room and enjoy the
Yeah.
time with the Gleeman, but doesn't and goes to bed anyway, and because he feels
Uh-huh.
sick. And so that connection, those kinds of small connections, which then get explained in a totally irrelevant conversation later, is, if it wasn't done on purpose, it was very lucky for Jordan to do that. But given the rest of Jordan's extreme world building skill, I have a hard time believing it wasn't on purpose. What do you think
No, that
about
was
that?
absolutely on purpose. And I think it's one of those things you don't notice at the time. You only notice it on the reread, which makes the book feel alive again. You know, that's one of the things that Jordan did super well is dropping those little hints. I think this is his great skill. I think this is why these books are the most popular. Is he's super good at dropping those hints, and some of them you understand and it gets you super interested in the story and you want to see where this goes, and some of them you don't understand until you reread them, and then you go, oh my gosh. And so it makes the story feel new and interesting to you, because the why Rand feels sick there isn't explained until many chapters after it happens. You probably didn't remember it. Sure, certainly some people do, but most readers wouldn't remember it. But when you come back to the story, you recognize it for what it is right away.
Hmm.
um, and so it makes the book feel even deeper, even though you already know what's going to happen. So that's hard to do right, but Jordan does that right so well and so often. That's why these books get the rave reviews that they do.
Very true. So now we're in Barrelon. There's gossip happening in the common room. There's an iceberg brought up that is a parallel. It's not even the iceberg of the story. It's actually like an iceberg that's like sort of a mile away that we can kind of see off to the side, but we still get reference to. This is the Logain story. The
Uh-huh.
the war down in, I think it's Gildan, that's
Uh-huh.
happening while everything is happening with the Emmonsfield Five. So and of course we'll get to Logain more specifically next episode, because Logain is introduced in this book towards the latter half, or the latter, latter half. But
Uh-huh.
um, what do you think? And I think this is kind of what we've been talking about a little bit with the iceberg stuff and with the placing plot threads throughout. Um, what do you think of this idea of having like a living, breathing world where, yes, there are heroes, yes, there are main characters, but in reality, there's still an entire world going on. Like theoretically, for example, because this is definitely a very, this is not a spoiler-free show. So if you're listening to this and you thought you were going to get away with no spoilers, you're wrong. So, but theoretically, like right now, you could even argue like there's so much more going on in the world. There's right now, as these folk are leaving, or are in Barrelon and going towards Camelin and eventually to Tar Valon, there's an entire faction crossing the Arith Ocean and landing, or well, they'll be landing in several months' time, but they're in the process currently of preparing to cross the ocean and return to the mainland, or to the Westlands. There's currently wise women in the Aiel Waste, doing machinations and preparing the way for their names, for their
Yeah,
Karamor
chosen one.
and
Yeah.
the chosen one. And there's all these things happening that don't come up until they come up, and then when they come up, it makes sense. Like it just, everything's been going on, and yeah. So specifically, this is best shown, I think, early in this book with Logain, because we first hear of the war in Gildan when the peddler
Uh-huh.
comes to town, and he's like, "There's a new false dragon on the loose, everybody," and then the Gleeman like brushes it away and says, "Oh yeah, that's old news. It's been going on for months now." So this concept, and then so did you? Mm, do you agree that that is one of his strengths and that that's a good thing, or do you have certain like kind of nitpicks about that?
Oh, no, not at all. Not only do I believe that that's Jordan's second greatest strength, is his ability to weave these worlds that feel so real. In my opinion, that's the only way that fantasy stories should be written. There is It's so much better to write worlds that way than to write these really flat, you know, Skyrim style worlds where, they're wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle. Nothing is rendered except for when the main characters are looking at it. It all just kind of waits for you to show back up.
Hmm.
No, that is a inferior way to write a story. And while it's way easier to write, it's just not as good. And you cannot, I think, as evidence of that, it's Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time are the two best-selling fantasy stories ever, except for Harry Potter. And they both do that. And they are so popular and remain so popular and have sold so many copies in large part because they do that thing. And not just that, but like the merch, the continued belief in the world, the video games and the TV shows
Hmm.
that have come out from those things, and the enduring communities for them because of this world that intrigues people. You need to write your stories this way, and Logain is, I think, the first example of how he does that. And also the, mentioning all these other nations and conflicts and people and all those things, definitely huge strength of Jordan's. um, I will take issue with Logain later in the books because I think he's a super interesting character that does not get used at all in many places where he should have been.
Hmm,
And part of that is Sanderson's fault. We'll get to that one later.
true.
But I think in the Sanderson books where you really start to talk about the Ashaman, that should have been a Logain POV instead of inventing a whole new character in book 13 and spending half of book 13 getting us to know that character when you could have just used Logain.
Yes.
Huge disservice to the character. Massive mistake in my opinion. Giant missed opportunity. I still enjoyed that book, but I remember being like, why is this not Logain? Why are we talking about him and not being in his shoes after having known him for 12 whole books?
Right, and
But
especially with the prophecies of Min set up, the prophecies that Min set up with
yes.
Logain, and yeah, 100% agreed. And we'll talk way more about the Ashman when we get
Hmm.
there, because
Hmm.
that was the faction that I was alluding to earlier.
Yes,
My
I completely
favorite
agree.
faction in the entire series is the Ashman, and I think it
Yep.
is kind of the wish fulfillment of, and it's a catharsis of
Yep.
of reading, of slogging. Well, I shouldn't say slogging because I did enjoy the books, but of going through 9. I think it is 9. Maybe it's only like 5 or 6, but
It's a
whatever.
lot.
It's
Yeah.
it's a number of books that I have to go through where the entire time men are just belittled and put down and thought of as, well. Granted, they were going crazy because of the
Yeah.
taint
Yeah.
and whatever. I get
They were a
that.
genuine threat.
It was a genuine threat, but finally the Ashaman are established and put under the dragon's protection, and it's like, yes, cool, men can breathe now. We don't have to worry about getting stomped out. And then when Nynaeve heals, that's a
Yeah.
big
Yeah.
spoiler later, but all of the
No, we're
all of the
we're
Ashaman
spoiler
plot,
we're
like,
spoiling everything now. Yeah, that was
100
you're right. That
100%.
cleansing the taint was
Yes,
absolutely
cleansing the
an awesome
taint,
moment.
dude. Oh man, it was so cool. And then not just
Hmm.
that, but also her figuring out how to heal madness.
Yep.
Like, not even the women of the
Yep.
Age of Legend could do that. And Nynaeve's just
Uh-huh.
like, "Oh yeah, I got you," and then a pulls a Flynn from Tron Legacy and just plucks out the madness and just throws it
Uh-huh.
away. Like, it's so good. It's so
Yep.
good. Anyway, we'll get into more of that later when we finally get there. But
And Robert Jordan just like, okay, they exist, and then walks away and just like they're just
yeah,
over there, and we don't talk about them. Enormous disappointment. Them and the Band of the Red Hand get done dirty, and it's
mm,
very sad.
yeah,
It's very
that's
sad.
fair.
I know this is a doesn't talk about this book, but I want to touch on it really quick because you
Okay,
mentioned it. I remember reading this book the very first time and seeing what he was setting up with the men versus women thing, and thinking that, like, you could tell he was going to cleanse the taint because you'd have to,
right.
in order for Rand to explain why Rand doesn't go totally insane before the end of the books. And I'm like, all right, cool. They're going to cleanse the taint, and then that's going to be like the beginning of the healing of this constant struggle between men and women. Like the taint is symbolic of why men and women can't get along and like always seem to be at each other's throats. And I was waiting for that to happen, and it never does. And that is one of the great crimes I think that Jordan does of this series is he sets that up in so many ways, but that was not actually where he was going at all. And I was
Mm,
very disappointed. Maybe that's just me. So maybe that is a me quip other people won't agree with, but that was something I was very disappointed in. So sorry
sure.
for the segue there.
No, it's fine. I think we'll get into that more towards the end of the series when we get there. But I have to look at what Sanderson does with, well, and granted, I don't think I cannot for the life of me think that this was a Sanderson original idea, but with the writing in the last couple of books, with the um altering of the Red Aja and what they become,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
their goal basically completely inverting, just pulling a full
Yep.
180 and going from we must kill men who channel to now we must basically marry men who channel. And so that's cool. And plus you also have to realize with your whole argument, or your whole issue with the cleansing of the relationship between men and women, there's still, what is it, 6 ages before the Age of Legend comes again. And this series is the end of the third age, most would argue, and the beginning of the fourth age.
Uh-huh.
And so there's still a grand old time between here and you know
Huh.
the Age of Legend come again, which um is
That's
when
a good
I would
point.
argue like the height of Aes Sedai culture, which during the Age of Legend the Aes Sedai were both the men and the women. But
Right. No, that's a good point. I had never thought about that. That is a really good point.
Right. And yeah, and I think Jordan says a lot of cool stuff with that, the spinning of the wheel thing.
Uh-huh.
And that
Oh
that,
yeah.
that actually gave the inspiration for the intro of this show, which you won't have heard yet, but you'll hear it when you listen to the show. I'm going to do a very dramatic reading of the opening lines, the wheel turns and ages come and
Yes.
pass and all that kind of
As you
stuff.
should.
But yeah, it's amazing.
His poetry is really good. It's
Yeah,
actually
yeah, yeah,
almost everybody I think does poetry wrong, but he does it really well.
yeah.
Does
Okay.
it really well.
Yeah, we'll
I like
definitely have
those
to talk about
quotes.
that when we get into some more of the prophecy stuff later in
Uh-huh.
book 2 and 3. But so going back to this story, they're now they spent some time in Barrelon. They got found in Barrelon because um the Dark One, as he's known in this portion of the book,
Uh-huh.
finds them through their dreams. Curious about that, because obviously we know who it is. It's not the Dark One, but if you can think to when like we were first reading it, or like upon for the first read through, what did you think of like the nightmare sequences and the dream sequences, and then with, I guess, with hindsight, knowing about Teleron Riyadh and the danger of the dream and all these things, does it, for me, because obviously like I knew he wasn't gonna die, but I also knew going back into it how much of higher stakes there are because of what Teleron Riyadh is,
Uh-huh.
that during those nightmares he could have been killed. Like he could have, like the Dark One or whoever it is could, and obviously we know who it is, but I'm just using that in the book.
Yeah.
Like he could have snuffed out the characters right then and there, but he didn't. He chose to toy with them and play with them. And what were your thoughts going back through on the reread versus on your first read of these like nightmare sequences and the dream world and all that stuff?
Well, so when I first read these books as a teenager, I remember thinking those were interesting, not really understanding why they were interesting. Uh, Looking back on them now, having reread them as an author, I think those see, and I can see why people don't like them. There's a lot of people who really have the ick, as they say these days, for
Mm,
dream sequences, but I think they're essential to the story because you are at that, like when the dreams start showing up, you're in a lull. There's the threat is now slightly distant, the goal is still really far ahead. You need to maintain the tension in the story. And there's a couple other ways he does this, but I think the dreams are one of the many ways where you remind the audience like, oh, something really spooky and weird and mysterious is going on here, even if the surroundings are just walking through villages
mm-hmm.
that are otherwise normal. So no, I think they're an essential part of the story, and a lot of authors I see fail on this in a little way. And it's a small failing, so I'm not trying to be overly harsh here, but like they'll get to that middle part of the story, which tends to drag in a lot of books because there isn't something that is causing immediate tension, and these dream sequences are that for this part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a fair position. All right. So I'm now going to kind of just sort of do a broad brush overview of the rest of the story up to Ardhold, because there's a really
Whoa, whoa,
big thing
whoa,
that,
whoa, whoa!
well,
You
but
cannot
hold on.
you cannot
Don't
move
worry.
on from Berlon without talking about Min.
We okay. So
I
that's what I was going to say. If you had something you wanted to, break into and, make it larger, then we can talk about it. So Min, let's talk about Min.
yes.
Her character, she's a soothsayer or a foreseer,
Uh-huh.
and she sees great
The auras.
prophecies of things to come. It's, and given that this is sort of a on the reread show, um, we know a lot of what these things mean, and frankly, it's awesome.
Mhm.
And we can talk about Perrin, but we can't talk about the Broken Crown until later. We'll talk about the
Yeah.
Broken Crown a bit later, um, and it'll wrap. So we'll talk about Perrin, the Broken Crown, Manetherin, and Arad Hald when we get to Arad Hald. Okay,
Uh-huh.
so but the rest of it's really cool, like the Lan with with the seven towers and the baby
Yep.
holding a sword, and
Hmm.
Matt with his raven and everything else she sees with him, and then Rand, obviously, she sees
So many things. Yeah.
So many things. It's hard to explain, but
So
go ahead.
I think I have very polarizing opinions about Min because on the one hand, the auras are brilliant writing, are
Mm-hmm.
absolutely brilliant writing. They are one of the best and earliest examples of the iceberg thing you talked about with
Yeah.
Robert Jordan presenting you with just enough information to go, wow, I want to learn more about that. And that with the auras, you get a whole bunch of them right away. Moraine meets Min and asks for the auras, and she delivers a whole bunch of them. And some of them, you know what they mean. Yeah, the characters don't know what they mean, but you, the reader, you know what they mean right away. Lance Towers and the baby with the sword, you know what that means immediately because his backstory has been mentioned enough that you're like, oh, okay.
Lord of the
The
Seven
rest of them, you
Towers.
don't make sense, but when they come up later, you're like, aha, it's the Ravens. Aha, it's the Broken Crown. So fantastic. That it is a fantastic piece of writing. It's a fantastic literary device that more authors need to use than I try really hard to use in my own books. Is
Hmm.
this idea that you present the audience with knowledge that only they have, that makes sense to them and makes them feel like they've discovered something about the story, and that's what Min's visions do throughout all the books. Very successfully in the first book, uh, mixed results later on, but in general, super well done, and it's a device that more people should use because that just that character who the things they say are kind of irrelevant to the story, like as it's happening, but they tell the reader some information that makes them feel very special. My so that's excellent. My other polar opinion about Min is that she is one of the most criminally underused characters in the story. For
Hmm.
someone who is there the whole time and is with Rand, like all pretty much every second of every day, starting in book 3. Really like, or somewhere in 4. Anyway, she's with him all the time, and she never does anything. She shows up, she delivers her auras, and they mean something to the reader, and that's great. It's a really well done um, device. However, they are never utilized by the characters until the final book in the last battle. Tuan is the only
Hmm.
character who ever takes Min's visions and uses them to the benefit of the story. And Jordan could have been doing that the whole time. Like instead of like all these situations where the character's like, oh, I don't know what to do, or like I need to go ask somebody for advice. He could have been having Rand or whoever ask Min for an aura and then like figure out, like, Min gives you 3 auras, 2 or 3 of them mean something to the reader, but only one of them means something to the characters. And so it makes the characters feel like they're figuring out something, and it makes the reader feel smart because they figured it out before the characters, and it moves the plot along. And you could have short circuited a bunch of these thinking and planning and plotting and figuring out with Min's power, which you have established right at the beginning of book 1. That he never does that ever until the last book, and I'm pretty sure Sanderson wrote that bit, is a huge letdown. Huge letdown. So it's one of the best things and one of the worst things he does at the same time.
Right. To kind of push back on that though a little bit, I'm fairly certain, and I could be mistaken, but I'm fairly certain there's a point in book 3 when Rand tells her, I don't want to know anything more. Like, don't tell me any more about my visions. Like don't, what you see above my head is your business. Don't tell me. I don't want to hear it. And
Sure.
so there, from Rand's perspective at least, that's where that's coming from. But I think there's a couple times in the story when Min's visions are used for the benefit of the audience to great dramatic effect. For example, when Min first rocks up on the scene in Tar Valon and sees death and blood and
Uh huh.
dying warders and whatever, and basically
Yep.
essentially prophesies 2 different wars that happen within the walls of the White Tower.
Yes.
That's huge, and
And well done.
do the characters do anything about it? No. Like, can they really? Not really,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But it's great for us as the audience because like we're on the edge of our seats, metaphysically speaking. And we're like, what was that? Like, this is
Uh huh.
the seat of power. What do you mean, Min? What do you mean they're all
Hmm.
gonna die? Like, okay, that was cool.
Yep.
I like
Yeah.
that.
Very cool.
But you're right. There could have been, and frankly, there should have been more use for her. And Yeah, no, I agree. There could have been, there should have been. But when she is used, it's cool. And I think that's why we want more, is because we know how cool it is when she is used
Yes.
properly.
Yep.
Right.
Suffering
So
from his own success in that regard.
yeah, very true. So there's Min, but she stays behind at Barrelon this time.
Yeah.
And so we now we move on. They bust out of the city because um Morgaine or yeah, Morgaine is able to sorry, not Morgaine, Moraine.
Yeah.
Derivations, am I right? But
Morgaine is also a character though, so
no, that's true. She's later. Sorry. Moraine gives the guards basically a magic show. Not the guards, but the White Cloaks. The
yeah.
White Cloaks are like, "We're gonna arrest you for being dark friends," and she's like, "Oh, you're gonna arrest me, are you?" And then she does her whole thing, and it's pretty awesome. And then they escape. The White Cloaks vow vengeance because they're White Cloaks, and that's what they do at this point.
I do.
And they get along. They're moving through. On the chapter is then called Road to Camelin. I believe I have the chapter list right here. I can check. The Camelin Road, right? So they're on the road from Barrelon to Camelin. They get accosted by a fist of Trollocs led by a half man. They fight a battle actually against the Trollocs, which I had forgotten about, and that was really cool on the reread. I didn't realize they had a full on battle at this point, but that's when again Manetheren shows back up in the story. Rand and Perrin cry the battle cry of Manetheren, and then Matt just goes full old tongue and starts spitting some bars, yo. And then Moraine is like, "Bro, that was fire," and they have a whole conversation about it. And then eventually they're still running after Lan kills the half man and all the Trollocs go full episode 1 battle droid moment.
Yep.
So that happens. They're running. Lan and Moraine disagree about where to go when they realize that they've been cut off. And eventually Moraine laments and they go to what Moraine calls Arid Hold. And the city known as Arid Hold, we get there and it's the first real metropolis they see, but it's dead. And that the fact that the first metropolis they see is dead, it has some thematic implications for the rest of the book or for the rest of the books. But they get into Arid Hold, and at this point, also Nynaeve is with them because Nynaeve found them in Barrelon and went with them on their escape because she didn't want to let the children out of her sight. So now everybody's in Arid Hold, and Moraine isn't transparent enough with the boys, and this is a recurring theme that we'll see throughout the series, I think, that Moraine's lack of transparency with the boys gets them in trouble. When then, if you look at it from the boys' perspective as they argue in the book, you're like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, she said it was safe. There's nobody here. Why would they care? But now is when we get into the drama that is Arid Hold, Manetheren, and the Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. No, I believe. Wait, is that plotline? I think it's in the second one. With the corrupted king. I think it's in Two Towers. So, we get into that. So now the boys are there and they've just put up the horses and they're going to explore the city. They explore the city until towards the end of day, and they meet a character called, I believe his name is Morgeth. And a lot of these bad characters have a name that starts with the prefix "more." I wonder what that means, but we'll get there. So we have Morgeth, who tempts them with
more death. Yes, more death.
Yeah, more death, more death.
D-E-T-H.
Oh, more death. Okay. More death. Okay.
It's more, and then it's got death in it. Like, come on, man.
Yeah, exactly.
A little on the nose, but minor quibble.
Yeah. So we get there, and now we're in Aridhold. This revelation is one of my favorite things in the whole book, because I just had it as I was listening to it in the car this afternoon. So when they eventually escape Mordeth and get back to Moraine and the gang, Moraine finally comes clean and explains to them the history of Aradhold and why it is now called Shadar Logoth, or the Shadow Waits. And we hear the history of it, like we heard the history of Manetherin
Yep.
earlier in the book, which we kind of skipped over um, during the Emmons Field days. But that's okay, because now we get to talk about it. So there's a tragedy that takes place during the Trolloc Wars that we only hear about in lore dumps like this, or in sort of side conversations that happen talking about it. And it's one of my favorite things from Manetherin and their whole plot, and the implications of what happened at Aradhol. So, Aradhol was once a great city, and it was second only to Manetherin in its defiance to the Dark One during the Trolloc Wars. And then a man came to Aradhol called Mordeth, who introduced himself and began corrupting the king. And Moraine goes over this very briefly, but there's an entire plot line of a prince and a company of his friends came to try to free his father from the control of Mordeth, and his friends were all put to the stake for it. There's a plot of an army from Manetherin coming to Aradhol to try to reclaim it, and it's been totally wiped out. No one's there. And so my thought process while listening to all of it, and I would entirely encourage you, dear listener, if you haven't, go and reread at least these couple of chapters. It's called The Shadow Waits, I believe, is the chapter I'm referring to.
Yes.
But my takeaway from this was essentially the Trolloc Wars were a worst case scenario War of the Ring, because the light didn't lose. The light ended up winning because of the sacrifice of the Queen of Manetherin, but everything that we get from the different lore bits about the Trolloc Wars, it reads to me like a like things went wrong in Lord of the Rings kind of story. Like, there in Aradhol, we have Rohan, right? The king of Rohan is, by the time the Fellowship meet him, is corrupted by a snake-tongued individual who convinces the king he's doing things right. And even down to the way Moraine describes the king, glassy-eyed and curly hair or whatever, it reminds me a lot of what happens in the Lord of the Rings when the Fellowship meet the king of Rohan. And it's almost as if, and this is the way it kind of reads, it's almost as if Aragorn were to have shown up there with himself and just the two hobbits, and Gandalf wasn't with them. Like, what would have, and Legolas and maybe even Gimli were there too. Like, what would have come of that? Like, they wouldn't have had the good magic on their side, and so something else, like, things could have gone horribly wrong. And in this world, in the Wheel of Time, things did go horribly wrong, and many of his friends were put to the stake, and he escaped after losing an eye, and he fled to the Northernlands, and there was all of this sort of like almost like a fan fiction what if of the War of the Ring, is kind of how I'm describing it. Because then after this, after the fall of Aradhol, is when Gondor calls for aid, and no one answers. As we learn in the opening few chapters, when Moraine gives when Moraine recounts the history of Manetherin to the people of what is now left of Manetherin, she explains they were promised reprieve if they could hold out for, but I think it was 2 days, and they fought for 7 days, and no help ever came. And so that's kind of, to me, like, well, what if Gondor and the White City had to fight on its own against these orcish hordes, and
Hmm.
Rohan never came to answer? You know,
Now
like,
that's a really great take. I've actually never heard that before, and I think I completely agree. That is exactly what that is. You can really see it as it's set up, and I think it's also an example of a good lore dump at this
mm-hmm,
point. You know,
true.
Moraine explaining to you what happened to this place is a lore dump, but it's relevant because it's affecting the characters right now. And there's a mystery, like what the heck is going on here? Moraine explains it, and then it immediately has an impact on their lives as the shadow of Shadar Logoth tries to kill them. So no,
Mm-hmm.
completely agree.
Last thing I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit about, and we'll get into more of it then later when we finish the second half of the book. Um, Matt from Cawthon and his
Uh huh.
character. Let's talk a little bit about him. I When I first read it, I was under the impression that Matt didn't get any memories from the past until his deal with the Aelfin. But this book seems to imply that he has a blood memory even before he meets the Aelfin. What
Yes.
what are your thoughts on that, like good or bad, and what do you think the implications of that are for the story?
I don't know if I have thoughts on that one. Disappointing podcast. You asked me a question. I don't have thoughts, but I think I think that is one of those things that just gets rolled into his elfin memories, which is book 3.
No,
Correct me. Four.
it's much later. I thought, well, yeah,
It's the
might be
door in the
4 or
Stone of
5.
Tyr, which they take in book 3. So it's in book 4. It's the beginning of book
Yeah,
4. He
beginning of
gets
book
his elfin
4.
memories.
Yep.
I apologize. So yeah, thank you. It doesn't really come up very much between here, book 1 and 4. So I feel as though Jordan had the intention of giving Matt these memories from the beginning, and this
Hmm.
was the start of that, and then realized that was not sufficient and did it later. I love Matt's memories thing. It's a super interesting trait that I 1000% stole for my own ongoing fantasy series.
Hmm.
No hate. 1000% stole. Different mechanism anyway. So super cool thing, but something that it shows up a little bit in this book and then kind of just gets forgotten about until he gets his memories from the other source, which is cool. So,
Yeah.
do you disagree? Am I wrong about how often it comes up in those books? Because I don't remember it. Every now and then he speaks in the old tongue, but that's it. It doesn't affect events really.
Yeah, no, he speaks in the old tongue, and he gets like weird looks for it. And then after he gets the
Uh-huh.
memories, he speaks in the he. So before he has moments of speaking in the old tongue, but after the memories that he gets, he has entire monologues where he
Conversations, yeah.
speaks, and he thinks he's just speaking common or whatever the language of the day is, and in reality, that whole conversation was just in the old tongue, and he had no idea. And so that's
Yeah,
cool. I do like, how those things come across. And to your confession about stealing it for your books, I won't lie. The Shards of Arthur's Shield, much of the interplay between my main character Thomas in that book, and his predecessor Arthur, is very much, very heavily inspired by Rand and Lose There and Telamon, the dragon.
uh-huh.
And it's a much smaller part because it's a much smaller story, my book is, but very much inspired by that. And I think that's something important to take away from this is so much of this, even though we have issues here or there with different arcs and different characters, different factions, there's so much that we can take away from it. There's a saying that goes, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And
Yeah,
so that's what we're doing. We're taking these things that we're inspired by, and we're deriving our own stories and our own plot threads from them. So
completely
there's
agree.
there's no shame in that, I don't think.
No, it's a good thing. It's something that more people should do. There seem to be some authors who feel as though stealing is bad and it somehow
Hmm.
lessens their work, and I completely disagree. I think there are some things that Robert Jordan does in these books that are really excellent, and more people should steal. There are some of these narrative ideas or fantasy tropes that I don't think I've ever seen in any other book. Like Matt's memories, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do that
Nope.
anywhere else, and it's super cool. Why not? You know.
Agreed.
So, I mean, I guess the Avatar state from Avatar: Last Airbender is kind of that, but not really.
Yeah.
So, to an extent. So, yeah, no, all for stealing. Do more stealing, especially if it's something good that people like. Just don't copy it too much.
Exactly. All right, I think with that we'll call it to a close. Hey everyone. Thank you for listening to the first episode of A Look at the Wheel of Time with authors A.B. Timothy and J.M. Goodwin. I really hope you liked what you listened to and you enjoyed the show. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like, and follow the podcast on your favorite podcast platform if one of those are YouTube and Spotify. We'll look forward to the next episode where we cover everything from chapter 21 through to the end of the novel, and the future where we get to enjoy everything else. The rest of the adventures of Evansfield 5, the mysterious White Cloaks, the esoteric Aes Sedai, and whatnot. Hope you enjoyed, and have a great day.